since we finished Elden Ring, or at least beaten it, I figured that we decided to do a tier list. Now, I am completely aware that there are some bosses that aren't covered because we either didn't defeat them or we missed, but I figured that we done a tier list for the bosses that we've done. So let me just explain how this tier list is going to work. Firstly, we are going to do the bosses in order that I fought them, according to all the videos. Secondly, this is just my opinion and this isn't simply true. Like, this isn't factual, it's just my general opinion on the bosses. We all have our different opinions, so my tier list could look different than yours. And 3, we are going to cover the main bosses, but there also are some bosses on this list that aren't here, so I will mention that. So if I out of the way, let's begin. So the first boss is the Grafted Scion. This is more of an enemy, if I'm being honest. I don't really like these enemies. They can be pretty annoying at times with certain attacks, but I usually avoid them. But in terms of tier lists, for me, I'm going to put this in A tier. These are pretty challenging for me, but they are just a normal enemy that I just hate. There's a lot of enemies in this game that I hate. A lot. So with that enemy out of the way, let's move on to Margit the Fell Omen. So Margit the Fell Omen, I feel, is probably the hardest first boss of the Souls games. Well, at least the Souls games that I've played. Margit kind of has 3 factors that make him pretty hard. So the first factor is he has delayed attacks. His attacks are extremely delayed for some reason, and I find myself dodging sooner than I want to. So that's really the first factor. Secondly, and this one is kind of rather common, well, not common, but kind of frequent, is input read. For those who don't know what input read is basically when you do an input, such as pressing square to heal, the boss will have a linked attack to that input. So for example, Margit will throw a dagger if you heal. Now granted, it's not all the time. No, it's mostly in the second phase, if I'm being honest, but I just find that input read is very annoying. Now thirdly, and this one's kind of like, to me really, but the hammer is very difficult to dodge sometimes. And some of his attack strings are also difficult, because if you dodge the first hit, you're guaranteed to get hit the second swing and the third. So I feel like Margit is also in A tier for that reason alone. So next up is Godric the Grafted, and I feel like Godric is much easier than Margit. Godric is a lot more learnable than Margit, because Margit has some funky timings. Godric has some consistent timings that you can actually get used to. Now, Godric is the second boss, so of course he's gonna be on the easier side, but even then, the move that can kind of be troublesome is the whirlwind attack and maybe the axe drag, but you can very easily learn those. His first phase is not bad. His second phase can be a lot more difficult. However, it's basically some of the moves from the first. Most of his moves come from the first phase, so if you do well in the first phase, you're most likely going to do well in the second phase. And I just feel like Godric is in B tier. He is not too hard, but he's not that well, to me, I feel like he's easier than Margit, but I don't think he's easier by a large margin. So next up is Red Wolf of Radagon. Red Wolf of Radagon is pretty annoying. Constant magic, which I mean, I guess that's Rhea Lucaria's theme, but I just hate dealing with magic, which we'll be covering with another boss next. But Red Wolf is a glass cannon, which is one of 2 bosses. I mean, you can argue the second one isn't, but Red Wolf of Radagon is a glass cannon, which means he deals a lot of damage, but he barely has any health. And this boss was actually the first boss I died to, if you remember. So I'm gonna put Red Wolf of Radagon in the challenging tier, but I would actually say it is probably on point with Margit. So another annoying magic boss, we have Renala. Renala is your average magic user. She just spams spells, and this fight is just tedious. The first phase is a gimmick fight where you have to hit 3 glowing candles to break her bubble, and then you have to damage her. And then the second phase is just a lot of magic. And halfway through the fight, she can summon some enemies to help her, that being either 4 wolves, a bloodhound knight, a giant, or a dragon. I like boss fights that are one-on-one, but the summon factor is pretty annoying, especially with the dogs and the bloodhound knight. They last an eternity. Thankfully though, she does not have a lot of health, so I think she deserves a little, I don't know, maybe a little bit more than the red wolf, but yet in the challenging tier. Next up is one of my favorite fights, General Radon or Star Scourge Radon. Star Scourge Radon may have a lot more health and deal a lot more damage, but honestly this fight is pretty fun once you know what you're doing. And he has a move called the Star Caller Cry. I hope I'm saying that right, I think I am. But in the footage that I actually killed him or defeated him, he actually never did it. He got poised right before doing it, which I think was pretty hilarious. But the second phase is a little bit trickier because he has some meteors that you have to avoid. However, this got nerfed. His second phase kind of got nerfed in recent patches. So with that in mind, I'm going to put him not too hard, but I'm going to put him above Godric. So next up is actually a boss that isn't listed on here, which is the Chronic Tree Sentinel. I hope I'm saying that right. This fight is pretty annoying, if I'm being honest. The first phase is fine, but the second phase is way too annoying because the electricity makes this fight harder. Especially the attack where he like swings forward and launches a wave of lightning and then slams down. That is pretty annoying, if I'm being honest. So if it was on this list, it would probably go into the S tier, because I just find it pretty annoying. But maybe like, if there was an A+, I would probably put it there. So next up is Morgott. I find Morgott a lot easier than regular Margit because his attacks are faster. Margit has long delayed moves. Morgott has some quick faster moves, which I honestly think that doesn't really make it easier, but I find it easier. So, and then the second phase isn't too bad. He just gets a couple new moves which can be easily telegraphed, especially the grab. The grab is pretty easily telegraphed. So I'm gonna put him in bottom A tier. I still think he can be challenging, but not as challenging as Margit. So next up is Mohg. And we're going to have a string of bosses that are going into the S tier. First off is Mohg. Mohg is very annoying. If you thought Margit was bad with his delayed moves, Mohg is probably worse. And plus, he gives blood loss, which for those who don't know, blood loss takes 10% of your health. But to bosses, it takes 10% of their health. But for Mohg, it only takes 7.5% damage. But also another annoying factor is, if you put blood loss on him, or he gets blood loss on you, he deals 20% more damage for 20 seconds, which I find that's extremely uncalled for. Oh man, we haven't even gone through the second phase yet. The second phase, which is Blood Boon Ritual, even if you have the tier, which you get from the NPC I comboed in that short, which you guys seemed to love, he heals 3 times and it's pretty massive. The second phase is pretty difficult. It is a pain in the butt. More fire, more bleed. It's just a pain. So I think he deserves S tier. So next up is Fire Giant, who is also S tier. I think everyone can agree that Fire Giant is just a generally annoying boss. I find him pretty annoying. Because you basically, he's a roly-poly. He just rolls around most of the time. And you have to run all the way to him. But you could also use Torrent. But Fire Giant is just generally a very annoying boss. He has a lot of health. I think the most health in the game, actually. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But I just think Fire Giant is a very annoying and difficult boss. And I think it deserves S tier. Now, Godskin Duo, I'm also putting in S tier. Godskin Duo is another annoying fight. Because, one, these two enemies don't belong together. It is very annoying because you got the Noble rolling around and then the Apostle doing Fire Tornado. And it is a very difficult fight. Not because that's actually difficult, but because the combination of these two enemies. It's just very annoying. And what's even worse is that they can respawn. They can resurrect each other, I think 4 times or 6 times. It's either 6 or 4. Thankfully, if you run a bleed build, they are very weak to bleed. However, I did not run a bleed build. In fact, I never touched bleed for this playthrough. I mostly stick to, well, it was magic very early and then strength. So I was mostly a strength through this whole adventure. After that little godskin duo, let's move on to one of my favorite fight, Malekith. Malekith is another interesting case. Because his first phase is not bad. In fact, I would say it's pretty easy. But his second phase is pretty difficult, but it is really fun once you get to know what he's doing. Malekith is another glass cannon where he has not a lot of health, but he deals a lot of damage. But Malekith, due to him having a glass cannon, and due to him being weak to like bleed, fire, magic, lightning, I think he deserves A tier, but I'll put him a little bit ahead of Margit. So next up is Gideon. Gideon is going in A tier, but I'll put him in front of Margit. Gideon is a very annoying boss. Of course you can cheese him with madness, but who is going to use madness? I mean, I know there's some people who would use madness, but me, I didn't use madness. And I just think Gideon is pretty annoying. He's basically Renala, but worse in a way. Because when you get him lowered to 50% of his health, he heals. Renala doesn't heal. Gideon just spams spells, incantations, and he even does incantations if you kill bosses like Moog and Melania, and that's really it. Next up is Godfrey. Godfrey is honestly on the easier side. I might put him in very easy, but I think I'll put him in minimal effort. Because Godfrey is not a difficult boss if you know what you're doing. If you find the Golden Shade, then you will most likely do well on Godfrey. His first phase is pretty simple. He does a bunch of stomps, he does a few axe swings, and when he reaches 75% health, he does a super slam. And the second phase, however, is not fun because most of his attacks are grab attacks. In fact, 60% of his attacks are grabs, which that is 3 out of 5 attacks, which that is just insane. But nevertheless, I find Godfrey minimal effort. So now let's move on to Radagon. Radagon can either be very easy or very difficult, because he is another boss that input reads. But for now, I'll put him in the middle, because Radagon is very weak to fire. Very. If you use fire, you're demolishing his health, for sure. Because if Radagon can be learned, he's not that bad once you get to know it. Elden Beast is honestly a little bit, honestly, probably the same tier, not too hard. According to the recent patch, and of course they patched it after I defeated the Elden Beast, you can use Torrent on the Elden Beast. Which, why didn't you able to do that earlier? But I digress. Elden Beast is not too hard. Sure, most of the fight is just getting to him because he runs away and just spams a variety of projectiles, but it's not that bad. Sure, I mean, there's Elden Stars, which is annoying, but if you know what you're doing with that, it shouldn't be that bad. So next up, we have Nile, which is another S tier boss. Nile is very annoying. Getting to him is annoying, and the fight itself is annoying. If it wasn't for the Divine Beast, I probably would have started to use Mimic Tier at this point. Because Nile is just a very annoying boss. To start, he has 2 knights that help him, and then when you fight himself, it's just very annoying. Thankfully though, this boss is optional as you do not need to kill him, but I killed him because I wanted to fight Melania, which we'll get to Melania in a little bit. So next up we have Loretta. Loretta, I feel like, deserves high B tier. Loretta is like Renala and Red Wolf, but less magic spammy. Loretta does use her Warsicle, which is a halberd, and the second phase isn't that bad. And once again, this boss is optional, but I feel like it's not even that bad. Now, the most infamous, most notable boss, the Melania Blade of Mikola. If you watched my stream, or if you watched the playback, you would know I defeated her first try. Melania can be annoying, but I don't think she deserves S tier, in my opinion. But I will say she does deserve A tier solely because of the second phase. The second phase, by far, is probably the worst part of that fight. The first phase is not bad. Sure, she heals 400 health per swing, or about 400 health. But, if I'm being honest, by the time you reach Melania, you could easily get rid of that health. And her waterfowl can be tricky. If you actually learn how to dodge waterfowl, then Melania is not bad. The second phase is really annoying, because her waterfowl now applies Scarlet Rot. But I would say, maybe it is probably the hardest challenging boss on this list. So now, we have a string of bosses that are S tier from the DLC. We are going to move to the DLC right now. But before we do the DLC, if you like this content, and if you want to see some more content, whether that new Warhammer Special Marine 2 that's coming out on September 5th, which I will be streaming on that day, consider subscribing, because it will help me out publish more videos like this to people like you. And comment down your thoughts on this tier list, because I want to know your thoughts as well. And with that out of the way, let's move to the DLC. Alright, so the DLC. Dancing Lion is going in S tier. In fact, I would say it's worse than Moog. While it is a very cinematic fight, the Dancing Lion is, you're fighting the camera more than the actual boss. And that's not a good thing, because the bosses in the DLC are like Bloodborne bosses, where they're quick, they're aggressive. So I feel like the Dancing Lion, while it is, like I said, cinematic, it is pretty difficult. The first phase is difficult, and the second phase is even worse, because the second phase basically has 3 sub-phases, being Lightning, Wind, and Frost. Frost by far is the worst because it is very annoying to dodge. Lightning is the second hardest due to the same reason, and Wind is the easiest because it's basically the first phase, but just with a few new moves, and that's really it. So next up is Rolana. Now Rolana is going in high A tier. In fact, I would even put her higher than Melania. Rolana is the only boss that I've beaten less than 5 attempts on stream. Which, if you want to see these videos for yourself, check out the playlist in the description or in the card above. But Rolana is similar to Melania in a way, where she's more passive in the first phase and more aggressive in the second phase. However, I do think Rolana is a tad bit harder than Melania, because Rolana, for one, deals a lot more damage depending on your Scuttle Tree fragment count. And 2, I just find some of her attacks to be pretty annoying to dodge. Even though I kind of beat this boss on my 3rd attempt. But nevertheless, this boss is pretty annoying. Well, not annoying, but challenging. So next up is the giant, or not the giant hippo. This isn't Dark Souls 2, the golden hippo. S tier. It is pretty annoying, because I don't know why, but the first time I went to this boss room, I got grabbed like on 3 or more several occasions. I just don't like this boss, because first phase it's a hippo, second phase it's a porcupine. But the second phase I feel wasn't too bad, but I was just glad whenever this boss was done. And thankfully, all the DLC bosses are optional, as you do not need to kill them. So next up we have, well, I'll just call it the Boar Rider. The Boar Rider, I feel, belongs in A tier, because whenever it charges at you, you either have to get your dodge just right, or you have to use a shield. Because at this point, when I was fighting this boss, I was starting to use a shield. But honestly, the shield was the only reason I beat this DLC. And by no surprise, this boss has a second phase, which the second phase really doesn't change much. Just a few new moves and that's it. But other than that, this boss deserves a challenge in A tier. Following another boss that's, honestly, I'll put not too hard, is the Scuttle Tree Avatar. This is probably the easiest boss of the DLC, or one of the easiest bosses, in my opinion. Because I was using fire, and this boss is extremely weak to fire, so that doesn't help. But, like I said, this boss is not too hard. True, it may be some annoying that you have to fight 3 of these back to back, but anyways, I feel like that the Skull Tree avatar is B tier. Now next up, we have Mesmer the Impaler. And Mesmer is probably harder than the Divine Beast. Mesmer is pretty quick. He is like Melania, but more aggressive. Because he has a lot of attacks that are just really difficult to dodge. And his second phase is not better. In fact, this boss might be the hardest boss I have ever fought in Elden Ring. That may be a surprise because there is a boss upcoming that is known for being harder. But I think Mesmer is pretty difficult because of the number of attempts. True, Divine Beast took me around 20 attempts. This boss, however, Mesmer, this boss is just really annoying. I had to switch to holy damage to kill him, and I was using a strength build. Thankfully, taking a break from the hard bosses, we have the Saint of Bud, which is, honestly, I'm either thinking about putting it in minimal effort or not too hard, but I'll put it in not too hard. Because this boss is simply like Melania's second phase. Well, this boss's second phase is basically Melania's second phase, where there's Budge's Scarlet Rot. Thankfully, I was using fire, so I made short work of this boss. However, I wouldn't say minimal effort. Nevertheless, I'll put her in not too hard. Now, for the last boss, Promised Consort Radon is S tier. Consort Radon first phase is not bad. The second phase is, honestly, I thought it would have been a lot harder, but turns out it actually was pretty difficult. I mean, this boss did not take me as many attempts as Divine Beast or Mesmer, but the area was also very annoying. So with that, I think he deserves S tier. Now, I know there are a lot of bosses that we've missed, but I just wanted to make a tier list through all the bosses that we encountered. So here's the complete tier list of all the bosses. And I appreciate, if you watch to the end, I appreciate it. I appreciate all the support and views that I've gotten across my content. And I hope to bring more content, more gaming content. So if you like this video, leave a like, consider subscribing, and comment down your thoughts. And I will see everyone in the next video.